Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor to speak at this occasion on behalf of an institution that has been a pillar of the Brooklyn community and really a pillar in Klal Yisrael for so many decades. You know, when we speak about the importance of the role of chinuch habanos in the totem pole of Jewish causes, yes, everybody would say it's important, it's significant. Friends, it's not important. It's not significant. We're going to speak about an inyan which is paramount, which in a certain respect is the very foundation of all of Klal Yisrael. You know, it's well known, or maybe not so well known, that in Europe before the war there was wholesale defection from Yiddishkeit in many communities. In Poland, in Galicia, in Lita. It's not like the revisionist history that you hear a lot about. It was so tragic that the Chafetz Chaim issued the following remark: Ein bayis asher ein sham meis. Literally, there was no home in the Jewish people that did not have some casualty to the forces of Haskalah, to the winds of secularism. There was a Goyen at the time, the Goyen of Slutsk, the Ridvaz, Rabbi Yaakov David Wolowski, who wrote a comprehensive commentary on the entire Yushalmi. He wrote a sefer Migdal David, Chana David. Rabbi Yerucham Olshin showed me that he also wrote a commentary on the Chumash called Nimukei Ridvaz. And in Parshas Boy, he addresses this phenomenon, the wholesale defection from traditional Judaism in Europe. And he definitively attributes it that even though the boys went to yeshivas or the parents hired malamdim, the girls did not have a formal Jewish education. And they soaked in the values, the ideals, the heresy of the streets. And the defection came from the women. And if not in that generation, then in the next generation. Ad Kedei Kach, the Ridvaz writes that this was the very plan of Paroi. This was the Eitzah of Paroi. You know, at first Paroi did not allow Klal Yisrael even to go into the Midbar for 3 days. And then finally Paroi calls Moshe Rabbeinu back and he says, okay, here, tell me please, who's coming? Miva mi ha'holchem. Who do you want to bring? And then Paroi says, okay, here's the concession. L'chuna ha'gevarim. The men could go. Paroi says the men could go. Says the Ridvaz, because Paroi knew that by allowing the men to go, it was no concession. Because if the men are going to go out into the Midbar, they're going to hear Shir from Moshe, they're going to strengthen in Yerushalayim, and the women are going to remain in Mitzrayim, soaking in the values of Mitzrayim, then Klal Yisrael will have no future. So Paroi says, L'chuna ha'gvarim. And Moshe says, not a chance, Paroi. Moshe says, the future of our people is at stake. B'nareinu uvizkeneinu, b'vanenu uvivnoiseinu nelech. If our daughters are not coming with us, there's no point in Kabbalas HaTorah. You know, about 70 years ago, there was a historic bris milah that took place in Yerushalayim of a grandson of Rav Moshe Chevroni, who, by the way, the kid was also a grandson of the Ger Rebbe. And it was like a who's who event of Gedolei Yisrael. At the bris milah in attendance were the grandson of the Alter of Nevardik, the Alter of Slobodka, the Alter of Kelm, the Chafetz Chaim, the Slonim Rebbe, the Vizhnitzer Rebbe. They were all there. And the Rosh Hashiva of Chevron, Rabbi Cheskel Sarna, great man in his own right, he gets up and he starts stirring the pot. He says, I want to pose a controversial question, and people are rolling their eyes. You know, like a bris milah is not an occasion for a controversy. He says, I want to ask you a question. You know, there's some pretty important people in the room. Who do you think was the most influential Jew in the last 100 years? And he starts really stirring things up. He says, I know you think it was the Chafetz Chaim, and you think it was the Alter of Slobodka, and you think it was the Alter of Kelm, you think it was the Ger Rebbe. I'm here today to say you're all wrong. They didn't know what to do themselves. The crowd was aghast. They start whispering, outrageous, sit down, stop stirring controversy. But Reb Chatzkel didn't back down. He said, I'll tell you more. The one who did the most for Klal Yisrael in the last 100 years was not even a man, never even learned to blot Gemara. They didn't know what to do with him. He said, when I tell you the name, you'll all agree. They laughed. But then he said, Sarah Schneer, and they all agreed. It's an amazing thing. You know, Rav Aaron Cutler is reputed to have said a similar thing in America. That the Torah in America today is due to the founders of the Beis Yaakov movement. If you look in one of the newest chalakim of the Igros Moshe, Chelek Tes, Rav Moshe says, you think it's a coincidence that as an introduction to Kabbalas HaTorah, the pasuk says, Koi soimar leBeis Yaakov, v'saged lebnei Yisrael. First the Beis Yaakov. Because if you don't have the Beis Yaakov on board, don't even bother with Har Sinai. Don't even bother with Kabbalas HaTorah. So we're here tonight, friends, to pay tribute, to show our support to a Mossad, which is not just a pillar of our community, it's a pillar of the entire Klal Yisrael, a pillar of the whole world for so many generations, for so many decades. Thank you so much for coming. Hashem should give Rabbi Levi and the whole Hanhala and the whole staff continued siyata d'shmaya and koyach to raise so many more nefashos and generations of loyal b'nai Yisrael ad bias goyel tzedek. Started. But we're also here tonight for our children. Aside from the chinuch that we give our children by sending them to Beis Yaakov, to Rabbi Meir, but we're always looking for ways to upgrade, to enhance what we offer our children in the home. And the truth is, in order to properly administer the correct approach to chinuch, we need to identify who are we? What are we? What does it mean to be a father and a mother? What is an av? What is an aim? You know, friends, if I were to ask you, define the word av. How do you define the word av? And many people have different definitions. Teacher, instructor, guide, caretaker, carpool driver. How do you define the job description of an av va'aim? Let's look at a very simple Rashi. Rashi tells us that when Yosef was finally reunited with his brothers, and the brothers were embarrassed just to look at Yosef, Yosef says, don't sweat it, don't worry. You didn't send me here. Kiyam Elokim, the Rebbeinu Shalom sent me here. Vayesimeni la'av leparoi. He made me a father to Paroi. What does this word av mean? Zakt Rashi, la'av, lechaver, ulepatroin. A friend and a supporter. Says Rav Shimon Schwab, from this simple comment of Rashi, we learn that the main job description of a parent is not to be a teacher, a rebbe, a mashgiach, a guide. It's simply to be the best friend of one's child. The closeness that a parent engenders with the child is the very job description of that role. Says Reb Schwab, I don't even need to go to Rashi. It's an explicit pasuk in the Chumash. In Parshas Re'eh, the Torah tells us about the very worst avera in the Torah. What's the worst avera? The mesis. Someone who seduces another Jew to serve Avodah Zarah. And the pasuk describes various relatives that may be involved in as a mesis. The pasuk says, Ki yisischa achicha ben imecha. Your brother will do it. Oy bincha, oy bitecha, your son or your daughter, or even oy eshes chekecha, or even a wife. Oy reacha asher kenafshecha, or your soul friend. Your soul friend Who is this person in our lives who's our soul friend? Says Rashi, and Rashi I think would know a thing or two about this. Says Rashi, Ze avicha, your father. Says Rav Schwab, from Rashi we learn that the barometer to determine how good of a job we're doing as a parent is, are we our child's very best friend in this world? And I think Rashi would know a thing or two about being a father. Look in the Shita Mekubetzes and Bava Metzia Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, where he dubs Rashi Avihen v'Rabban Shel Yisrael. Rashi is the Tata and the Rebbe of the Jewish people. And Rashi defines father means to be the child's best friend. I want to share with you something now. Literally one of the most revolutionary ideas I ever came across. And this gives insight into what Rabbi Levi was mentioning before, by the Akedah. The Akedah begins, Vayhi acharei hadvarim ha'ela, achar hadvarim ha'ela, v'oleikim nisas Avraham. Vayomer elav Avraham. And Avraham says to the Ribono Shel Olam one word, Hineni. Behold, here I am. Says Rashi, what does the word Hineni mean? Rashi says Hineni, Lashon Anava, the Lashon Zimon, a language of humility and being prepared to do the will of Hashem. So of course Avraham responds to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with great humility. Hafla v'fela, a little while later, Avraham Avinu is taking Yitzchak to the Akedah, and Yitzchak is a little bit nervous. What's going on? So he turns to his father, Vayomer Yitzchak el Avraham Aviv, Vayomer Avi, Tata, is that you? You're going to do this? You're going to bring me to the Akedah? Where's the sheep? And Avraham says one word, two words, Vayomer Hineni B'ni. Behold, here I am. What does Hineni mean? Lashon Anava v'Lashon Zimon. The same word that Avraham used to speak to the Ribono Shel Olam, Avraham used to speak to his child. Says Rav Gamliel Rabinovich, one of the leading Mikubalim and Mashpiyim today, but also one of the primary addresses of parents with disillusioned teenagers. Says Rav Gamliel Rabinovich, from here we learn that with the same humility you need to speak to the Melech Malchei Hamlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. With that same anivus, you need to speak to your children. Says Rav Gamliel, there is no question in my mind that the reason why Avraham was zoiche to have a son who is a gadol hadar like Yitzchak is because he spoke to him be'anivos. He said, say what you want. Call me revolutionary. Call me nouveau chinuch. Every issue of chinuch comes to my table. And in almost all cases, when parents have trouble with children, it's because the child feels the parent doesn't understand them, speaks down to them, doesn't value them, doesn't speak to them b'lashon hineni, says Ram Gamliel Rabinovich. And he takes us even further. Says Ram Gamliel, what we ask a young boy and girl to do today, 2025, is not equal to Akedas Yitzchak, is more difficult than Akedas Yitzchak. We tell a teenager, ignore the street, ignore the media, ignore the values of society. Don't look at them, don't think like them, don't act like them, don't dress like them. If Avraham was only successful in equipping his child to surpass the great Nisayon of the Akedah by speaking to him b'lashon anivus, then the only way we will be successful in equipping our children to pass the challenges of 2025 and the Dar of the Ikvus of the Mashiach is if we speak to them, we show them that as parents, we are their closest ally, their closest chaver, their closest supporter, and we speak to them ba'anivos, and with humility, and with kavod, and with value. And you know what? It's such a chashuv in olam. I'm afraid to say, Pashat, what he says next. Look in the first edition of Tiv Torah, where he says what his mother said. I'm afraid to say it tonight. What? You can't even say these words. But he says his mother said that for 2025, if the Aseres Hadibros were given, and that alone is heresy, which is probably why they took it out of the Sefer in the first place, what the Torah would say. And we'll leave it at that. But people used to come to Gedolim, people used to come to the Stipler, the Brisker the Eitzais, Sgulais, in raising good children, Erlicha children, with Midos Toivos, with Yer Shamayim. I want to share with you one of the honorees from Minsk. I just came back from Minsk. I was in Belarus. Actually, the trip was prepared by a Beis Rabbi Meir parent. I don't know if he wants me to give his company a commercial, but I went on a great trip with Laleches, and we actually went to Belarus. Now, back in the day, if you wanted to go to Belarus, you needed a visa. There's an app. You apply on an app, and you could get a visa. But as of 2 weeks ago, to go to Belarus, you had to go down to Washington. They put a special visa on your passport. You have to go through the Lithuanian border and then through the Belarus border. And I'm sitting on the bus. You have to commission a special Belarus authorized bus. I'm sitting on the bus. It's 12:30 a.m. I'm preparing my speaks for the different kvarim. All of a sudden, there's a flashlight in my eye. Passport. I look up, there's a soldier there from 1948, frozen in time, the same uniform. I'm shaking, I showed him my passport. We were zoicha to daven at the kever of the Chafetz Chaim. When I was a bacher in yeshiva, I had the zechus 2 times to meet a Gadol B'Yisrael, one of the last Talmidim of the Chafetz Chaim, Rav Mordechai Zuckerman. Rav Mordechai Zuckerman lived in Givat Shaul. He lived in, if anybody would see his hut, they would be astounded that anyone had lived in something like that for the last 500 years. Rav Mordechai Zuckerman was once interviewed, and he was asked, you're Rebbe the Chafetz Chaim. He lived in a generation of all-time great Gedolei Yisrael, and yet he was elevated to become Rabban Shel Yisrael. Nobody makes the move without the Mishnah Berurah. What was the secret ingredient of the Chafetz Chaim? And Reb Zuckerman said, the secret ingredient of the Chafetz Chaim, among a few other things, was the tears that his mother shed that her son should be Zoicha to be a God-fearing Jew. Later in life, when Chafetz Chaim saw the tear-drenched Tehillim of his mother, he broke down. He said, do you know what this Tehillim did for me? You know how my whole life is built on this Tehillim? When the Chafetz Chaim already started to become recognized as a Gadol, they went over to the Chafetz Chaim's mother. Chafetz Chaim's mother wasn't some, miracle worker Rebbitzin. She was a regular Yiddish mama. And they said, Aim Chafetz Chaim, how'd you do it? What did you do? What were your techniques? What was your tzidkus that you were zoicha to have a son like the Chafetz Chaim? And she would say, get out of here. What are you talking about? You know me. I'm a regular Jewish woman. You got the wrong lady. And people would push her. And she was just a regular lady. Get lost. What are you bothering me? I don't do anything different than you. And they pressed her, and they pressed her, and they pressed her, till finally she said, you know what? I remember when I was a Kala, a few nights before my chasana, my mother said, could I have a few words with you? She said, sure. She said, I would like to present you with Sefer Tehillim. The minhag of Jewish women is that if you have a few minutes, you finish cooking, the kids are sleeping, you're up early in the morning, you have a minute here, a few minutes there. The minhag of Jewish women is to say Tehillim that their children should grow up to be Yirei Shamayim and Bali Midos Tovos. If you ever have a few moments, make sure you daven for the spiritual welfare of your children, and make sure you always shed tears. And that's what I did, she said. Whenever I had a moment here, a moment there, I always cried bitter tears that Yisrael Meirol should illuminate the world with Torah. V'niskabel tfilasa. They came to the Brisker Rav. Brisker Rav would sit at his table, and he had all his boys around the table, and he would learn with each one Lefi Madregasai. And they would ask the Brisker Rav, Rosh Yeshivas would come to him, in the early days of the state of Israel. Many, many Rosh Yeshivas, Nebuch, they had children that were lost to the Communist Party, to socialism. And they asked the Brisker Rav, how are you Zoiche in this climate that all your children are Yereim v'Shleimim? How'd you do it? What were your techniques? He said, techniques? There are no techniques. There's only Tehillim and tears. Listen to this. Says the Brisker Rav, never in my life did I offer one dry-eyed Shmoneh Esrei. Anytime I ever davened, it was always with bitter tears that my children should grow up on the straight and the narrow. Another time the Brisker Rav said, people want to know why kids have trauma today. You know why they have trauma? Because when their parents are rocking them to sleep, they're singing lullabies about kids rolling down hills and having their heads decapitated. I don't sing nursery rhymes to my kids. I say Tehillim, I cry Tehillim, that they should grow up to be Yereim Ushleimim. This is like my favorite all-time story. So a couple came to the Stipler, and they said, Stipler, could you give us a bracha for good children? Stipler said, bracha? What was a bracha? A mazoinos? I'm not eating them. You're the parents. You have to daven. You see my little boy over here, Chayimul? Every day I'm mispalel that Chayimul should be a Yerei Shamayim and a Loimei Torah. You know how old Chayimul was then? He was 52 years old, one of the Gedolei Hadar. So you want to know when the job ends? The job never ends. It's never too early, it's never too late. It starts before they're born, and it never ends. Even if your child is a Zayda himself or a Baba herself, it's still the responsibility and the primary responsibility. Reb Volba says, what's the main obligation of a parent? The main obligation of a parent. Reb Volba says that if somebody kills B'Shoigeg, he goes to the Ari Miklat. When does he get out? When the Kohen Gadol dies. What did poor Kohen Gadol do that somebody gets out of the Ari Miklat when the Kohen Gadol dies? Can you imagine, somebody visits the Ari Miklat, and after davening they give a clap, and everyone's crying, Shir HaMalois Mimamak. So who are you davening for? The Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol's sick? No, but we want him to be sick. They're davening, they're mispalo that he should be knocked off. What did the Kohen Gadol do? That they don't get out of the Ari Mikla until the Kohen Gadol passes on? Says Rav Volba, from here we see, so the Gemara says, well, he should have davened that under his auspices, nobody killed B'Shoigeg. Really? Says Rav Volba. It says in Achrei Mois, the job of the Kohen Gadol is to daven, that nobody's hammerhead goes flying. That's the job description of the Kohen Gadol. Says Rav Volba, from here we see that when you're in a position of responsibility or authority, your primary obligation is to pray for the people you're responsible for. And the main hischayvos of a father and mother is to pray for the spiritual, emotional, and physical welfare of their children. You know what? And I'm happy I'm speaking about this today. Because I'm sure today you received messages and emails and reminders to say the Tfilas Hashla. The Tfilas Hashla. Tfilas Hashla. Okay, Baruch Hashem, the Tfilas Hashla day is over. Now we don't have to daven for our kids for another year. But the very same Shla, codified by the Mishnah Berurah, says, La'olam yehei shagor b'fi ava'im tfila al b'neihem. That what? That they should be loimdei Torah, Yerei Shamayim, and Bali Midos Toivos. It should be Shagor B'Fiv. It's not reserved for Erev Rosh Chodesh Sivan. The Shla identifies 3 key times in davening to be mispal for your children. In Berchus HaTorah, when you say B'niyah Anachnu. In Ava Rabbah, when you say the same B'libeinu L'havinu L'haskil, or Ava Soilam. And when you say Nuvala Siyon L'man Lo Niga L'rik V'Lo Ne'ela B'Hala. But it's not reserved for those 3 times either. It's all day long. You're at a red light. You're pushing the wagon in the store. You're walking down the street. It's the primary obligation of a parent to mispalel for the physical, emotional, and of course spiritual welfare of their children. My grandfather, Zechasak Levracha, for those of you who lived in Flatbush. Maybe you knew him. Rabbi Rabbi Glatstein. He was a rabbi in Pittsburgh for 70 years. And then he came to live with my parents. He was a Talmud Muvak of Rabbi Menachem Zemba. He passed away at 106 years old a few years ago. He would tell me that he remembers more than 90 years before how his mother would pour her heart out over his bed, and he remembers how those tefillos became part of him and stand up for him even on that day when he was over 100 years old. So the tefillos that we put into our children are the greatest investment in our children, and the zechus of coming out tonight to support one of the pillars of the Jewish people, one of the pillars of Torah and Klal Yisrael today. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu answer all of our tefillos. We should all be zoicha, banim uvnei banim, banois uvnei banois, meirim es ha'olam, ba'torah v'masim toivim, b'chol meleches avodas havoirei, adi askal tzedek, and hervi amenu, amen.